Hey guys, so next segment of the video. In this one I'm going to do the rear end because I still haven't pulled the front end off the race R. So here we have a Lone Star no-link swing arm, freshly powdered gloss black. And again, as I said, I always use TM Designs sliders and chain guides and all that stuff. So I've already installed a brand new TM Design chain guide on this. This is the Banshee style, and each swing arm is going to be a little bit different. So if you have an OEM swing arm, you're not going to use this style. They have a specific one for the OEM mounts. The Banshee style, the bolts are closer together. And a lot of LSR, I'm sure a bunch of other brands, they all, for some reason, use the Banshee style slider or chain guide. So that's what this one uses. Now, some of you may not know, so in this one, I was going to use these Delrin bushings and replace the needle bearings, but the needle bearings are still good in here, so I decided to not do that. I'm just going to hang on to these for when I need, when the needle bearings wear out on one of my machines. But these are basically a Delrin bushing. It has some O-rings. There's an O-ring in the inside here to seal it up. There's an O-ring on the outside here to keep water from going down in. And these are pretty cool. I've heard good things. I haven't tried a set yet, but I do have a couple sets. These are made by BDT, but there is another guy on the Facebook 250R groups that's making them as well. And let me just say this. I am not 100% brand loyal. I use the best parts that are out there. And I know a lot of people don't like BDT. They've never done anything wrong to me. I always get my parts really quickly. So until something happens, I have no problem ordering from wherever. And I like to, my first go-to is normally the 250R groups, all the guys putting in the time and making these things. I bought these before I found out someone else in the group was making them for the 250R. So next time I purchase a set, or after I use these up, then I will, support the community, support the guys like myself who are, working a day job, putting the time in after hours, and keeping the 250R alive. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say on that. So prepping to put the swing arm on. The bushings the needle bearings are already in there. I never took them out for powder. If you need to replace your bushings, the easiest way to do it is to get a long screwdriver, put it in from one side, and start hitting it. The issue you'll run into, and especially I know with Lone Star they do this, they actually have an inner ring that is almost it's a stop for the bearing. So that can get a little tricky because it's about the same size as the race of the bearing. So when you're trying to hit it out, if it seems like it's not coming out, that's why. I don't know of an easier way to do it. So normally I take a long rod screwdriver with a thin head, and if I have to, I'll break right through that inner hub, that inner stop. And then when I put the new one in, if it's bent a little, I'll knock it in and it'll straighten it out. So it's really just there as a stop. It's very important to keep these greased. Anyone who's rebuilt the 250R after 20, 30 years knows the pain of getting a swing arm bearing out, and if they're seized in there, it's just not fun. So when I do put new bearings in, I always put anti-seize around the whole thing. And then I knock the bearing in, then I grease the inside of the bearing, get a bunch of grease, put it on your finger, rub it all in through the rollers. And I use red high-tack grease from, I forget the name, but they sell it at Home Depot. And it's a thicker stuff, goes in nicely, get it in there. So that is the initial setup. And make sure if you have an 86, 87 versus 87, 89, make sure you order the right bushing kit, the rebuild kit for the swing arm, because the space in the 86, 87, you need extra bushings. So, you know, just something to keep in mind. When I order rebuild kits, I don't have anything specific. So, you know, whatever one you find, pretty much fine. So then you have this inner sleeve that goes in, and this is what rides on the bearings. So I've already greased up the bearings. I don't need to grease up this as well. So I'm just going to slide this in. And ideally it lines up. Slides in. Doesn't always. That's where your trusty dead blow hammer comes in. There we go. And then you have your end cap bushings. So the long side always goes in, short side out. So we can now tap these in, and again, if you have fresh powder, they don't always slide in super easy. Check that inner edge, make sure you don't need to remove some of the powder. Alright, this one's going to give me trouble. There we go. Okay. And that inner rod bushing will ride within this. Alright, so now we've got that. And then we can put our end caps on and make sure the seals are in there. Little rubber seals. Slide those on the ends. And now it's ready to install. So, what I normally use, actually this is the wrong swing arm. Alright, pivot bolt. Let me grab this pivot bolt. So when I'm using standard needle bearings, I always use a Glann Innovation's greaseable pivot bolt, and it's hollow. There's two holes here, and there's a zerk on the end. And that allows you to pump grease into there, keep that swing arm greased. As you can see, there's also a zerk. LSR typically has a zerk on the swing arm itself, so you can grease everything up really well. You don't need, if you're using these Delrin bushings, you don't need to grease anything. They just slide. Delrin is naturally has a lubricant within it, I believe. So these are supposed to, you don't need the, I think you still use the center sleeve, but honestly it's optional, I think, because I don't see a purpose for it. That center sleeve rides on the bearing itself, and actually now that I think about it, that center sleeve won't even work. So you eliminate the center sleeve, you eliminate the outer, pretty much the whole rebuild kit. This is all you need. You just drop these in each side and you're good to go. So, cool product. If I was using those, I would use probably a normal swing arm pivot bolt, but since I'm sticking with this, I'm going to use the Glann greaseable pivot bolt. I think these are around $50, $45, $50, and you know, I run a lot of Glann stuff, so really like it all. Then we have, so chain slider, again, TM Design, and they do make an OEM version, and then they make the aftermarket version. When you get it, it's not going to be drilled for the mount here. So what I do is I put this on, kind of get it centered, and then I whack it with the dead blow, and it'll leave an indentation on the inside from this mount, this boss here. And then I can drill it out and, you know, set it up, good to go. So this one is only slightly used. I'm going to reuse it on this. Make sure you don't forget, if you're using one of these, and I highly recommend you do, you almost need to, make sure you don't forget to put this on before you mount the swing arm. Otherwise you're pulling it back out. And I've done that. So, get the swing arm up in there. And if all is well, like this one is perfect, it's going to line right up. So in this case, I like to use a bucket, and depending on your setup, your stand, how you're working, you know, you find something that just can support it. So in this case, we'll do that. Then I'll get my pivot bolt. And I'm not even going to grease this right now because I can do it later. You can rub some grease on it if you want. No harm in that. So now we've got our swing arm there, it's supported, perfect height. I'm going to put my nut and washer on loosely. Again, a lot of these things I don't tighten down initially because I may have to take it off later. Alright, so now that we've got that, the next thing is our carrier, our bearing carrier. So they make two types of carriers. One is a straight bearing and one is a tapered bearing. The tapered bearing you're going to pay more for. I've actually never used one. I have enough carriers that I just keep reusing them and the bearings are still good. But next time I upgrade, I'll probably use a tapered bearing because what that does is the side load. When you have a straight bearing and you put side load on it when you're sliding through corners, it's going to wear that bearing out much quicker than a tapered bearing. The tapered bearing, you know, it's circular, but it's almost cone-shaped a little bit, then it's cut. So that side load is where the tapered bearing excels. I've been running these normal bearing carriers since I started racing last January, and I've never had an issue with it. But over time, you will. So those are the two types. As far as the carriers themselves, there's a lot of brands out there. Most of mine, I think, are LSR. I know there's one other company that's highly recommended with tapered bearings, and I can't remember it right now. But there's eBay ones out there. I can't speak to those. I always normally try to stay with known companies, high quality stuff, and again, I've had no issues. Make sure when you get your swing arm powder that they tape off the inside of the carrier area. And then, unfortunately, they didn't listen to me this time. My guys should know by now, but the brake stay bushing, that little circle, the bushing that slides on there, have them tape that off because that bushing has such a tight tolerance. If there's powder on it, you're going to spend a while sanding to get it to work, and that's what I'm going to have to do here. So I'll do that later. But I used to use anti-seize on the inside of the carrier, thinking maybe it would slide easier over time. But some other guys say, well, you just get sand and grit and dirt and stuff, dust that builds up, and it's just going to grind. So anymore, I just let it go. So you drop your carrier in, and if it doesn't go in like this one, that means the pinch bolt area is a little too tight. So another good tool to have is a thick flathead screwdriver. And you just get it in there, pry it open, pry it each way, you're going to tighten down later. And ideally that will, sometimes, I know this one has a little bit of powder on the inside where they didn't tape it quite right. But you can always use the dead blow. There we go. Freely spinning. And I like to turn it all the way forward. You can do this later. That has to do with the chain, which we'll get into in another video. But just kind of get it set. Got that in there. And now the next thing we're going to do is put our brake stay on. So my setup on my no-links, and I use the same setup on all of them, is a Glann Innovation's 400EX brake stay. This is clocked back. So rather than the caliper sitting on top, it's clocked back. And that's because on a no-link, the caliper hits the airbox and can crack it, mark stuff up. So I switched to this system, tried it out on my race bike, and everything worked great. So now it's on my hybrid, and it's on here because all my bikes are no-link. If you don't have a no-link, no need for this. Regular brake stay is fine. You're not going to hit, the caliper's not going to hit the airbox. So this is just a standard brake stay, slides on your carrier, slides into the groove, and I think I'm going to have to do this later. I'm not going to put my bushing on right now because I got to sand that powder off. So we slide that in. Now you can see the angle of my caliper is way back here rather than being up here. And you do run the risk if you get hit where it could damage the caliper. Thankfully, I haven't had that happen, but you know, overall, it's a better system for me because you get more travel with a no-link and it starts to smash up that airbox. And when we get into the airbox, I'll show you what I do with that, but you know, still better idea. Now the difference with this, because it is a 400EX, is it uses a 400EX rotor and anti-fade. And what's crazy is, look at the size difference between 250R, 400EX. This is a thicker caliper, or thicker rotor, and much larger diameter. And whenever you're working with brakes, a larger diameter gives you more leverage. And a thicker rotor generates less heat. It can still heat up, but it's not going to heat up as quickly. This is 3.5 millimeters, and I'm pretty sure the 250R is 2.5 or 3 millimeters, the normal. This actually has an upgraded 3.5 millimeter rotor on it, but if you're using the OEM, it's thinner. And most guys, you know, honestly, I can lock up the brakes no problem with the standard 250R rotor. This was created by John Glann because he used to work with a guy who raced Pikes Peak. And that guy was on his back brakes so much that they would just fade. Because you get fluid heats up, it thins out, so you don't get as much braking pressure there. Then when your caliper or your rotor heats up and your pads heat up, you're not going to get as much stopping power there. So by doing this, and he was actually using, I think, even a 4 millimeter or even thicker rotor that Galfer made for him. But yeah, the stopping power is much better. The negative is you lose a little bit of ground clearance, because if we look at that, you're losing a solid inch. I'd have to measure it, but it's at least an inch of ground clearance. So if you're going to run this setup, you definitely want to have some sort of skid or some way to protect this, because if you get dings in here, that's going to transfer to your pads, and now your pads are going to be grooved, and you're going to lose surface area, contact, and all that stuff. So I'm working on some brake stays right now, initially for the OEM, but maybe something for this. This is tough because I use his brake stay, so I'd have to coordinate with him to actually give me an area to mount a skid to. But if you, on my race quad, I have an ISF Swingarm that has 450R skids, the back quarter skids. So I'm able to run a Texera skid there, and then I just made a new replaceable poly skid that is larger to cover the bottom of the rotor, and that's worked out great. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do on this one yet, and actually this swing arm might get swapped out with my race bike because this has no skid mounts. And I probably should have just gotten them added, but it also allows me to, I can swap this out, test some of my new stuff that I'm working on, and and then I'll figure it out later. But for now, I'm just going to run this, and yeah, but you got to think about protection, because the more you bang up, that's another benefit of the 3.5 millimeter rotor, is you're not going to bend it as easily. I had a guy that was telling me his brakes locked up, and we pulled his hubs off, and it was literally, his rotors were like this. So we straightened them out as well as we could, but the thicker rotor is not going to bend as well. So if you do take a hit, you could always pop it off, put it on the grinder, get rid of those ridges so it doesn't mess up your pads any worse, or especially if you're going to put new pads on. So I'm not going to put this on yet because I don't want to put the axle in, but that'll just slide on. As far as anti-fade versus OEM lock nut, obviously anti-fade's a lot easier because there's just one or two set screws that lock it down, as opposed to the extra nut that's on the OEM ones. Obviously, your cost is higher this way, but for me, it's much easier to adjust. I have an OEM swing arm and an axle. I'm still trying to get it free, so I'm going to have to apply heat to it and do that. But so that's where we're at there. And then the Glann Clockback brake stay uses a 450R caliper, which honestly, the 250R rear calipers are getting harder and harder to come by. So by going to a 450R, parts are available. It's much easier to find. It's not a dual piston, which a lot of people complain about, but you know what? I run 450R calipers on all my machines and I have no issue with brakes. I mean, there must be some reason that Honda went from a dual to a single piston caliper, and you know, I think they just put a bigger piston in here versus the two smaller ones that are in the 250R. And then the pads, I think, are thicker as well. This needs new pads, so I gotta order those. But don't be afraid of the single versus dual piston, because the 450R has been raced since '04 and nobody ever complained about it. So definitely much easier to find one of those calipers and a hell of a lot cheaper, because I know some of the 250R calipers are going for $200 plus, $200 to $300, and they still might need a rebuild. So I don't see any reason to stick with the 250R. You know, newer components are fine. If you're doing a restore, totally different story. So that's it for today. I wanted to keep this one short, but next time we'll probably finish this out and we'll get on to the next thing. I'll have to figure out what that's going to be based on parts and what I can pull off of the 250R. All right, so have a good weekend, guys. See you next time.